welcome to Lightning Components 101 and Apex Developer's Guide. Before I get started, I just want to say Dhanyavad. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak in Chandigarh. I've had the pleasure of visiting India a couple times, as I mentioned, to Bangalore and Delhi and Agra as well. Always have loved my experiences there, and definitely hope to return back at some point once we're able to travel places again. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Adam Olshansky. I'm a 6-time Trailhead Ranger, 14-time certified Salesforce MVP, a Salesforce Engineer for the Devices and Services team at Google. But I'm really passionate about helping people to code on the Salesforce platform. I volunteer as a Red Women coach and love speaking about Salesforce development. If you want to follow me afterward, feel free to find me on Twitter, Adam17AMO. Shoot me an email, adam@adamtoarchitect.com. Of course, my blog, adamtoarchitect.com. And if you're not yet on the Lightning experience yet, I have a Pluralsight course that might help you out, bit.ly/lightning migration. All right. So with that, I want to get into kind of why I wanted to give this talk today. And so this slide here is kind of a snapshot of kind of my career growth so far, right? I'm going along my career developer journey up my personal mountain a little bit more every day, learning along the way. And as I'm growing my career, I've primarily been a backend developer. Started with Java, moved over to Apex, and I started hearing some of these terms that kept popping up, right? Terms you may have heard before as well, like front end, JavaScript, client side, right? And as a backend developer, Apex developer, I kind of knew they were there, but didn't really pay too much attention as I kept kind of growing my career and climbing up my own personal developer mountain. Then I started seeing polls and statistics like this. This is a survey from Stack Overflow from last year, 2019, of over 72,000 professional developers. And they asked the question, what languages do you use most frequently in your software development? And for the 7th year in a row, JavaScript was number 1. And almost 70% of developers reported using JavaScript. Close second to JavaScript, HTML and CSS, of course, along with JavaScript, are the primary languages of front-end web development. In case that wasn't proof enough, I also saw statistics like this from GitHub, where, again, for the 7th year in a row since 2013, JavaScript has been number 1 in GitHub pull requests. In fact, 20% of all requests, pull requests that come into GitHub are for JavaScript. In case you're curious, Apex is 39th on the list. And so I kind of started ignoring some of these front-end terms. There's my video. I kind of was ignoring some of these front-end terms. And after seeing some of these polls, I kind of took a look around one day and realized I was pretty far up the mountain and I didn't really have all the support I needed. There was a lot looking down that was kind of terrifying me. And I kind of knew I had to do something about it. I really had to get a deep dive and understand what is this front-end JavaScript Lightning component model of development. And if I don't start learning it, I'm potentially going to be left behind and kind of be stranded up on the mountain without any way back down. All right, so that kind of brings us to why I wanted to get into this and potentially teach others that were in the same boat as me. And so my expectations for today is maybe you're an Apex developer or have some familiarity with backend coding. I don't want anyone walking out of here thinking they're going to be able to learn JavaScript in 40 minutes. I'm not sure if 40 hours will be enough time, but what I do want you to walk out of here understanding is that there are common patterns between front end and backend code. And I'm going to start talking about some of those patterns. And I want to start talking about what is kind of the same with front end component code and maybe some new tips and tricks you can pick up. And at the end of the talk, I really want you to have more confidence to maybe not be so scared of some of these front end JavaScript type terms and really get the confidence to start this part of your own developer journey. All right, so I'm going to start things off with an Apex overview. We're going to talk about kind of what do we mean when we say components. We're going to do a compare and contrast between kind of the old way of programming Visualforce and the new way of programming in Salesforce with Lightning Web Components. We're going to do a deep dive into Lightning Web Components and do some more demos, take a look at some code. And then we're going to wrap things up and talk about, all right, where do we go from here? Where's step 2? and maybe even step 3, where do we go from today? All right, start things off, let's talk a little bit about Apex, right? We already kind of know this, but just kind of a review of some of the concepts we talk about Apex. Right, and for the most part, Apex comes in 2 flavors, right? We have our triggers that are code that run as a result of events that fire, right? Before insert, after update, some database event fires and it triggers my code. Then we also see classes and controllers, right? And these classes and controllers, files that'll have methods and parameters and return values. And then mixed in there everywhere we have variables, right? This is kind of what we're used to on the backend side. We're also probably familiar with terms like this, at future, annotating methods. We're also familiar with using interfaces like batchable, where we have to have kind of predefined templates for how our code is structured, right? We have to have a start method, we have to have an execute method by virtue of using this batchable interface. So we're familiar with that concept in Apex as well. Then we're somewhat familiar with Visualforce, right? It's a button-based UI. It's based on the model view controller architecture. Uses HTML style tags, right? Apex page, Apex data table, right? There's all these tag-based markup that we see in these pages. And then we're also familiar with bind variables and bind methods, right? Curly bracket bang, some variable name, reference some variable in my Apex controller, and it'll display or be updated potentially in my Visualforce page. Same thing we can call our Apex methods from our Visualforce as well. As many of you are aware, if you've worked with Apex and Visualforce in any capacity, there are some, let's say, gaps when it comes to working with Apex and Visualforce. Right, for starters, we run into governor limits. It's very button click based, so there's a lot of repetitive clicking going on. A lot of times we get, let's say, poor performance, right? Things take a long time to load. We have to wait for Salesforce to do its updates and then send it back to us. And we end up with kind of hacked together solutions, right? We might Google a problem, find an answer on Stack Exchange or Stack Overflow of how to do something. We throw it in a random script tag. We don't really know what it does, but it works, kind of like this car, right? Doesn't look great. There's probably a better solution, but it works. So we plug and play and don't worry about it. But as developers, we know that this is no way to drive a car, right? There has to be a better way. There has to be something we can do to optimize our code and be proud of the code that we're writing. And so with that, let's get into kind of this new programming model. How do we kind of improve and we stop hacking together solutions and do something a little more industry standard, maybe? I like to call the new model MVC++. You may also hear it referred to as MVCC. We'll talk about why in a second here. Before I talk about the model, let's talk about kind of how we got here, right? Salesforce's own developer journey, right? They started off, of course, late 90s, early 2000s, and UI, web development was just kind of coming into its own. Salesforce realized this and came out with a UI solution, Dreamforce 2007, called Visualforce. You can now customize your own UIs. And that was great for a while. But we saw JavaScript and responsive UIs have been king since 2013. Right? They've been pretty popular for a while. And Salesforce recognized that. Users didn't want to have to button click their way to do anything anymore. They wanted responsive UIs that responded to updating a slider or entering a value without having to click buttons every time. And so Salesforce adopted an open source JavaScript framework called Aura and came out with the Aura component framework. And they launched that in August 2015. And that was fine for a while, but as JavaScript's become even stronger, industry web standards have developed even more. Salesforce needed to adapt to this also, and that's why January 2019, they launched the Lightning Web Component Framework, and that's where we are today, based more on industry standards. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So at this point, the talk today is going to primarily focus on Lightning Web Components, and I intentionally am skipping over Aura. If you have not yet gotten into Aura development, my advice would be just skip straight to Lightning Web Components. If you have gotten into Aura development, that's great. My advice is to stop working on Aura and go to Lightning Web Components. The product manager for Lightning Web Components said himself, all an Aura component is a Lightning Web component. wrapped up in something that is then delivered to you as an Aura component. So when you're writing an Aura component, you're essentially writing a Lightning Web component that runs slow because it has a bunch of stuff it has to be packaged into. So if you need to do additional component development, my suggestion would be skip straight to Lightning Web components wherever you can. All right, so before we look at some Lightning Web components, let's talk about the framework and how things work behind the scenes. So again, for the most part, MVC, we know this is what we're used to. We're on our laptops, right? We're the client, and we send a request to the server. In our case, the server is Salesforce. Salesforce is going to load the Visualforce page. Salesforce is going to run the application logic through the Apex controller. Salesforce is going to query the database in Salesforce, and it's going to return back to the Visualforce page on the server, which then gets returned to you, the client, in the browser. So everything's happening in Salesforce. And because of that, there's kind of a double performance hit waiting for the request to go to Salesforce and then come back to your browser so you can see it. And with the new model, the objects and fields aren't going anywhere. The database still lives in Salesforce. Apex isn't going anywhere. The Apex controllers are still going to live in Salesforce. But we're actually going to move the entire view over to the browser, over to the client side. And so the view is being rendered in the browser now. We don't have to wait for Salesforce to come back with the view anymore. And what's the good of having the view in the browser if we have to wait for Salesforce to do all the logic? So we're adding a controller to the browser as well. So the client side now, we're going to have a front-end UI and a front-end JavaScript controller. So you see here now we have both controllers on the front end and the back end, and that's why you sometimes hear this referred to as MVCC. All we're doing, moving the view and one of the controllers to the client side. All right. I think last thing before we get into our demo, what do we mean when we say a Lightning component? All a Lightning component is, it's a container for multiple files, right? And we're already kind of familiar with this concept of using multiple files, right? We have a Visualforce page, we have an Apex controller, maybe we have an Apex helper, maybe we have a CSS static resource somewhere. But now, instead of having to explicitly tell our Visualforce page, hey, I want to work with this Apex controller, I want to pull in this static resource for CSS, I don't have to tell all my files about each other anymore because they're all bundled together in a component package, right? So my UI is going to know what controller to use automatically. My UI is going to know what CSS to use automatically. It's all bundled together, right? And again, like Apex, they're kind of two flavors of components. But again, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the Lightning Web component side of things today. So we're going to have a UI component, a controller, maybe some CSS. And then if you've looked at source code at all, you're also probably familiar with an XML file that comes along with pretty much everything in Salesforce. Same thing with LWC. All right. So before we talk about kind of what's new with components, let's talk a little bit about what's not new with components. So I'm going to go through a couple of things here that actually are not changing with the new model. And one of them is tag-based markup. So we're already familiar with this, right? Apex page tag on a Visualforce page. And that's not changing in Lightning Web Components. The names are changing, but the tags aren't, right? Instead of having Apex tags, we're in the Lightning Web Component model, so we're going to have Lightning tags. We're embracing industry standards. We're going to have some more standard HTML tags. Instead of having to Google Salesforce tag name, you can just Google the tag name. And we're also going to have more custom tags, right? We're going to be able to bring components into our other components, and we're going to reference them generally using the default namespace of C as the prefix to reference those tags as well. And we'll see some examples of all of these. But again, the concept of tags we're already used to from Visualforce. All right, the concept of firing code as a response to some event, right? Again, we're used to that, right? Before insert event happens, after update event happens on the database, and we fire off a trigger. But again, now we're moving the UI to the front end. So we don't necessarily want to have to wait for database events all the time anymore. We want to be able to respond to browser events. Browser events like when the user changes a value or when the user clicks somewhere on the page. So instead of waiting for database events, we're going to fire off some code in response to events like on change and on click. All right. Very similar also if you are responding to a button click in Visualforce, we're going to be able to respond to button clicks in Lightning Web Components as well. Again, the concept's the same, the names are a little bit different. Again, same thing here, bind variables. Once again, the name is going to change slightly, but the concept isn't. We're taking away the exclamation point, but we're still going to reference variables in a bind syntax, refer to variables in our controller from our UI. And methods, same thing. We're going to be able to refer to methods in our controller from our front-end UI using the curly bracket syntax if we're going front-end UI to front-end controller. We also may have to reference methods from our front-end controller to our back-end controller, though. And we're going to see how we're going to be able to bring those in and actually give them custom names. We'll see a demo of that a little bit later. But for the most part, though, bind methods aren't really changing. The last thing here, I mentioned this already, the idea that we're using multiple files to put things together, right? We're already kind of familiar with the concept of having a Visualforce page and an Apex controller and maybe a helper class, maybe a static resource. We're just putting all that together now, right? We're still going to have a UI file, an HTML file. We're still going to have a primary controller, in this case, our JavaScript controller. We are still going to have that Apex controller, though, if we need to do some additional processing on the back end. All right, so let's do a comparison here of Visualforce and Lightning Web Components. Let's go see it in action here. So I'm going to bring up Salesforce here. And we see I have this component up here that says hello world. And this is my hello Visualforce component. And we see we have the word hello. We have a button that says update. So I could say hello Chandigarh, click update, takes half a second, and then Chandigarh appears in my text here as well. All right, so that's great. Not great performance maybe, but it works. Let's see what happens with the same thing with our Lightning Web component, though. Here it already says hello world. And as I'm typing now, the same behavior happens. I didn't have to click any buttons. I didn't have to click anything, and I didn't have to run any Apex for this to happen. As I was typing, it showed up on the screen as on its own. And that's due to the power of Lightning Web Components and having everything happen in the browser directly without having to call Salesforce. So let's go take a look at that code and see how it did that. All right. So first, let's start with the Visualforce code. Take a look at the Visualforce code here. Again, we have some tags, right? Apex page, Apex form, Apex page block. We see in line 1, we're telling it, hey, I want to use the hello world controller. And then we're saying two primary things here. We have an output text tag and an input tag, right? And our output text is going to show a value of hello and then the bind syntax greeting for the greeting variable. The input is going to be the greeting variable. That's where we're going to store that information. And then when we click the button, we are going to tell it, hey, whenever this button is clicked, go re-render the output value, figure out the greeting, and display it. And if I take a look at the Apex controller, hello world controller, pretty straightforward, just a getter and setter on the greeting variable, right? Code isn't complex, but it's all happening on the server side. So let's go take a look at our Lightning Web component and move everything into the browser now. And this is our Lightning Web component code, right? We see some standard HTML tags like template, very similar to Apex page. But again, we see two primary components here. We see an output tag in the form of our paragraph tag, P, standard HTML tag. And then we see an input tag. Again, instead of Apex input, now it's Lightning input. But the behavior is the same. Our output is still saying hello greeting with the bind variable syntax. And our input is still storing the value of greeting. And now we see we're having a method being called in response to a browser event. So when the value of greeting changes, our onChange event, we're going to fire off this method called handleChange. And if I take a look at the controller here, this is my JavaScript controller, my hello world controller.js, again, part of my Lightning Web Component bundle. So I didn't have to tell my HTML file this is a controller to use. It already knows because they're part of the same bundle. Let's go take a look at this line by line here. So the first thing we see are a couple keywords. If you're used to developing in Java, you're probably already used to importing in different libraries. And we can do that with JavaScript as well. It's a way to bring in additional functionality from different places. And we'll see a bunch of things we can end up importing. In this case, pretty much any Lightning Web Component you write is going to start out with a line that looks something like this. We're going to import the Lightning element library from LWC. And we're also going to have this line to export and extend Lightning element. Right. Again, we're familiar with the idea from things like the batchable interface of having to include certain lines of code to make things work. Same sort of thing here. All right. So after we export it, we see another kind of new word here, and that's @track. And @track is called the decorator. It's one of 3 we're going to cover today. And a decorator essentially is an annotation we can give to a variable to give it some special properties. Right? Again, we're used to the concept of annotating things like @future with methods in Apex. Here we're annotating a variable. The annotation is @track. The properties @track gives are, there's 2 parts to it. Number 1, it makes it a private variable. And number 2, it makes it reactive, which means it's going to automatically re-render. So if you saw in Visualforce, we had to tell it, hey, when you click the button, go re-render the output. Because greeting is @tracked, we don't have to tell it to re-render. Whenever it changes, it knows it needs to update itself on the UI. One nice development with Summer 20, almost all variables are @tracked by default. So you may not see this keyword as much anymore, but if it does come up, you'll know what it does. All right, so now that's out of the way, we have line 4, our greeting variable is @tracked. We start with a value of world. Line 6, again, we saw when the greeting input changes, we want to call a method called handle change. It captures the event, the change event. And the change event is going to say, hey, I'm going to take in the event that caused me to change. And line 7, I'm going to set the value of the thing that caused me to change to the greeting variable. So basically, whatever you typed in, whatever you changed is going to be stored as the greeting variable. And because greeting has @track on it, it automatically updates. So that's why whenever I changed the value in the text box there, it automatically showed up in the output. And that's the whole Lightning Web Component. Again, works faster, no Apex required. All right, so what did we just see here? Once again, we saw component markup, right? We're used to this already. We saw code running in response to some events, right? We're used to that concept already with triggers. We saw variable and method bindings that we're probably already used to. We saw we didn't have to explicitly specify what controller we wanted our UI to work with because it's part of the Lightning Web Component bundle. I mean, again, we saw no Apex required to make this functionality work. All right, so let's go take a deep dive now into Lightning Web Component specifically. And I think the first question, at least when I saw Salesforce coming out with this, is why? Didn't you just come out with a JavaScript framework a few years ago? And they did. And again, we saw JavaScript's been very popular since around 2013. Of course, 2015, Salesforce developed or launched the Aura component framework. And that's because in this kind of 2014, 2015 timeframe, the web looks something like this. But don't worry too much about all the text in the blocks here, but focus more on the ratio of green to orange, where green is JavaScript frameworks, what they were capable of and what they were responsible for doing. And the orange is the web standards, kind of what the web was responsible for doing. And back in 2014, the frameworks were pretty heavy. You know, you may have heard of frameworks before, be familiar with things like Angular, jQuery, React, right? JavaScript frameworks, very heavy, doing a lot of work, and the web standards were a little lax. You fast forward to 2019 though, and the ratio has actually shifted quite a bit. The web standards, the browser, is actually pretty powerful in handling a lot of these things that the frameworks used to have to handle on their own. And because of that now, number one, makes it a lot easier for everybody if everybody's working off the same standard. But number two, it's also allowed the frameworks to become a lot more lightweight. And so Salesforce responded to this and said, look, that's great. Let's embrace these web standards, take advantage of them, and kind of come out with our own model here. And this is kind of Salesforce's response to that. And you see again here, the Aura component model on the left, doing a lot of work. And then all the orange on the right is the Lightning Web Component model. There's still some Salesforce specific stuff in there, right? They still have Salesforce security. They still have the Lightning data service, which we'll see. They still have the base Lightning components like Lightning input, right? Those base components, that's still Salesforce specific. But a lot of the web components model is based on the web standards that are already out there that are being used by everybody. And I think it's a big win for Salesforce to be able to embrace a lot of those. All right. So with that, we talked a little bit about what's old with web components. What do we kind of already know how to do? Let's talk about some of the new exciting stuff. What do we get? What additional things should we be focusing on for this kind of new component model here? And the first one, once again, I'll stress it, those industry standards. I think it was a great move for Salesforce, one, from a developer ecosystem standpoint. Think about all the web developers out there that now can say, hey, I'm already doing web development, right? 70% of professional developers reported doing JavaScript work. Now they can start doing that work on Salesforce. And I think it's also great for the already existing Salesforce developers, because as you're kind of not forced, but maybe it's in your best interest to start learning some of these standards, your skills are applicable both on Salesforce and off Salesforce. So if you want to go in a different career path one day, if you want to take on more work, maybe off platform, or even keep doing work on the platform, you're going to be doing work that's very, very similar to all the other web developers out there. And so it's not going to necessarily be, I'm a Salesforce developer who can only work on Salesforce. It's going to be, I'm a Salesforce developer who can work anywhere, or I'm a developer who can also work on Salesforce. And so I think it's a win-win for everybody there. With the standards, Salesforce has joined a lot of industry standards boards now, and they're going to have a say in developing those standards moving forward, which I think is pretty exciting. Another thing we're going to see is all of the logic is being moved into one spot. And what I mean by that is, you might be familiar with this concept in Visualforce of shoving everything into this curly bracket bang syntax and having Visualforce evaluate it, right? I can have curly bracket bang, some text, some variable, some more text, and Visualforce will process all of it. And we're not doing that anymore, right? All of the logic is now being moved into the controller where it belongs. And the UI is just going to be for rendering the output of that expression. Another thing we're going to see is multiple primary Apex controllers, right? In Visualforce, we kind of already have this concept, right, with extensions, but we always had to specify a specific controller. And now with Lightning Web Components, we can have as many controllers as we want, and that's why I like to call the model MVC++. Another new thing with Lightning Web Components are decorators. We talked about @track already. We're going to see two more. Again, these are annotations we can give to variables that'll give it some special properties. I thought there was one more, but I guess not. So with that, let's dive into a demo. And again, I want to focus on some of the concepts. All the code will be made available to you after, so don't worry about every specific piece of syntax. We're going to, for the most part, go line by line. But again, if you don't understand a specific piece of syntax, you'll have the code afterward. Focus on the concepts and some of the new specific features. All right, so with that, let's go take a look at our first component here called Create Accounts. And the component specifically actually is called LDS Create Record, LDS being Lightning Data Service. And we have a couple things on the page here. First, we have an ID. A little bit bigger. We have this kind of ID text box that's disabled here. We have this name box I can type into. We have a button. And then we have some text here: create a record without writing server-side code. Always consider Lightning Record Form and Lightning Record Edit Form first. And then we have a link that says View Source. And if I click on that link, it'll open up this GitHub repository going to this repo specifically for the component called LDS Create Record. All right, so I can see the source code that's making this component happen. That's great. Let's go see what this component does though. Let me create an account called India. So I'm gonna click Create Account, and I see this toast that comes up here. So success account created. I see this account has an ID, ends in FEYTAAX. I go take a look at my accounts. Refresh it. I see, yes, in fact, I have an account called India. Again, it ends in FEYTAAX. So this is the account I just created. Once again, this happened without any Apex. And let me see if I try changing this here. Once I change anything in this name field, now this component assumes I'm creating a new account, and it's lost context of the old ID. So the ID disappeared. Once I change this here, let me create one called Chandigarh. create that account. Again, we get our success toast. We get a new ID here, ending in NAAH. And again, if I take a look here, I'll see this new Chandigarh account here. Okay, great. So I created a couple accounts, no Apex. When I created them, it gave me the ID back. And when I changed the text in this, the ID went away and it assumed I wanted to create a new account. Let's go take a look at how all that happened. All right, so here's our LDS create record HTML. This is the UI. And a couple things I want to point out here. For starters, line 1, the template tag. We saw it in the last component too. This is kind of the equivalent of Apex page in Lightning Web Components. It's a standard HTML tag. It'll pretty much start all your Lightning Web Components. All right, so we have the template tag. And then we have what are generally referred to as Lightning base components, right? Again, tags, this concept we're familiar with already. Here we see a Lightning card, which is very similar to an Apex page block. Basically a section of the page. And then again, we see a couple Lightning inputs. We see a disabled one for the ID. We see another one for name. And then we see a Lightning button. Again, very similar to Apex input or Apex page button. We have a button called create account. And then again, we see our second Lightning input here has an onChange event. So when I type something new into that field, whenever that value changes, we're going to fire off some JavaScript called handle name change. Whenever I click the button, just like I can in Visualforce, I can have an event, some code responding to the onClick event. So when I click, we're going to fire off some code called create account. So under all of that, we had this other section down here talking about the source code, right? And here we see the tag for that is called CViewSource. And again, if you remember toward the beginning, I mentioned that C refers to the default namespace. So if you're in an ISV and your org has its own namespace, this may be a little different. If you're not, generally this will be the letter C followed by the name of your custom component. So this is a component that you have built that you are bringing in to your parent component. So I have another component in my org called ViewSource, and I'm going to reuse that all over the place. And we're going to see how we're going to be able to do that. So I have a custom component that I built called ViewSource. Now I borrowed in this case, called ViewSource that I brought into my LDS create record component. So CViewSource. Just like we can pass parameters into methods in Apex, we can pass parameters into components with Lightning Web Components. And so here I'm going to pass in a parameter called source, and I'm going to set it equal to the value of LWC/LDS create record. And we're going to take a look at what that does in a second. So I have this ViewSource component, I have some text, and you saw that text on the screen as well. All right, so let's go take a look at this ViewSource component real quick. And remember, we're passing a value into source. And ViewSource is pretty small. Again, we have a template tag. Again, we have some custom HTML tags, a div tag, a paragraph tag, P for an output, an anchor tag, A. And if you're not familiar with HTML tags, an anchor tag basically is a link you can click on. And the specific URL is defined in this href property. And in our case, the href for the anchor tag is referring to some variable called source URL. Right, and again, we have the text view source that we saw as well. All right, so we know we have a source URL variable, we see it here, and we know we passed a value into the source variable. Let's go take a look at the controller for this ViewSource component and see what it's doing. And the controller looks like this. Again, we see our import statement. Again, we see our export statement. We have a variable called base URL in line 4 that's going to some GitHub repository. And now in line 7, we see our second decorator at API. And then we see our source variable we passed a value into before. And the reason we were able to pass a value into source is because at API, again, has two properties. It makes the variable public, and once again, it makes it reactive. So if it changes, it'll automatically re-render itself. But by virtue of being public, that means we can pass values into it from other components. We passed a value into source, and we saw we are displaying the value of source URL in our HTML. And that's because we're taking our base URL, we're concatenating the source. Remember, all the logic's happening in the controller now. And then we're able to render that in the UI. And so we can use this view source component in pretty much all of our other components, pass a different source to it, and we're going to be able to point different pages in Salesforce to different places in our GitHub repository, which is pretty cool, right? So at track, private and re-render, at API, public and re-render. All right, so that's great for view source. Let's jump back to our LDS create record though. All right, so again, remember when that name field changed, I'm calling a method called handle name change. And when I click the button, I'm calling a method called create account. All right, let's go take a look at the controller for this component here. And I see a bunch of import statements here. So again, line 1, we see we're importing from LWC. That's great. Line 2 and line 3, we're seeing we can also import from some other Lightning libraries. We're going to import that toast functionality, the thing that says success account created. We're going to import that functionality. And we're also going to import this method called create record from the UI record API. And this is what allows us to create records without having to resort to Apex. So we can import from LWC, we can import from other Salesforce libraries. We can import, again, there's that C default namespace. We can import from custom components. So I'm going to import some method called reduce errors from some custom component we built called LDS utils, some utility component. All right, so I can import from there if I want. I can also import from my Salesforce schema. So in this case, I'm going to import from the account object, and these names I can make whatever I want. I'm going to call it account underscore object. And line 6, I'm going to import the name field on my account. And I'm going to call it, again, whatever I want. I'm going to call it name underscore field. Why would I want to import my objects and my fields? Well, if you're used to developing in Apex, you may have run into the problem where you put some object or some field in a bunch of different classes, and then you realize you want to change the API name. And now it is a nightmare to have to go find every single reference and comment it out while you change the API name. By doing it this way, we don't care what the API name is because we're importing it at runtime. So not in the case of account and account named, if I was working with a custom object or a custom field and I wanted to change it, that's fine. It doesn't really matter what it is because we're going to import the values at runtime and we're going to call them account underscore object and name underscore field. And we're going to reference them like that later. And so our Lightning Web Components are metadata aware and will update themselves, so you don't have to worry about all those references anymore, as long as you import them in this manner. All right, so we imported a bunch of stuff. That's cool. Again, line 9, we see our account ID is at track. So whenever the account ID changes, it'll re-render itself. The name field starts off as nothing. And we see our first method here, handle name change. So again, we're capturing that change event. When the text I was typing in changed, this method gets called. And whenever handle name change is called, we see the account ID is being reset. That's why when I started deleting some text, or if I typed something else in, the account ID would be reset because it changed and it's being tracked, it re-rendered itself. And then the name field is being set, or the name variable is going to once again be set to the value of the thing that caused the event to fire. So whatever is in the text box is then assigned to the name variable. All right, so that's handle name change. Remember when we clicked the button, we also called another method called create account. And again, these are just some import statements from up above. This is lower down in our component. So line 17, we see our create account method. So when we click the button, we're calling this here. And line 18, we're just declaring some structure called fields. And line 19, you see we're referencing that name field from up above, and we're getting the field API name now at runtime. So when the button is clicked, we're going to go fetch the API name. So if it changed, doesn't matter because I'm getting it here. So I set the API name of the name field to whatever the name variable is now. That's great. Line 20, I create a new structure. Line 20, I think you or someone may be off mute.
Yeah, Parth, can you please mute yourself?
Okay. So line 20, again, we're going to create a structure. We're going to pull in the API name from whatever our account object is called now. We're going to put it in along with our fields that we just constructed. And then line 21, we're going to call that create record we imported up above. And that's what's actually going to create the account in Salesforce without any Apex. And whoops. Okay. Okay. All right. Screen's jumping around on me for some reason. All right. So again, we see, okay, we call create record now. That's great. We imported it from up above. We're going to create the account. And then we go on and see line 23. We're just setting our account ID variable to whatever the ID from that created account was, which is why, again, it changed. It's being tracked. It re-renders itself after the account is created. And that's why we could see it there in the component. All right. Let's go take a look at one more component here. Let me move here. Okay. This one's going to be called, where is it? There we go. This one's going to be called Apex Wire Method to Property. So we're going to be working with some Apex here. The UI isn't so interesting. It's just a list of contacts and a list of opportunities. So not much going on here, not really any interactive capability. We just have a list of contacts from our org, and we have a list of opportunities and the amounts. Once again, we see our view source component, call an Apex method that retrieves a list of records using @wire. In this recipe, the Apex method is @wire do component property. Again, we see a link called view source, and this time view source takes us to part of our repository called Apex Wire Method to Property. So once again, we can reuse the view source component and take it to a different place in our GitHub repository. Let's go take a look at what's happening here and take a look at how Apex gets involved. All right. So here is our template for here's our HTML UI file for our Apex Wire Method to Property component here. Again, we start with the template tag. Again, we start with the lightning card. We have the word contacts and a header tag. Line 6, we have some more interesting stuff though. We see if true contacts.data. So you're probably familiar with if statements, conditional statements already from Apex. We can do the same thing. You're probably familiar with this also in Visualforce, right? Rendered if, or if, whatever. We can do the same thing with Lightning Web Components. So this is the syntax for it here, if true. And in our case, we're checking on contacts.data, and it's in that bind variable syntax. So we know that we're referencing some variable called contacts and some property on contacts called data. And if true for this purpose just means if there's something there, if it's not null. If there's some value in contacts.data, we're going to go down into line 7. And again, we're familiar with for loops from Apex. For each value in contacts.data, very similar to an Apex repeat, we're going to call that item contact. And we're just going to display contact.name in line 8 and an output tag, a standard paragraph tag, just contact.name all the way down for each contact in our list. Line 11, we see if context.error is true. So if the error property in our context variable is true, again, we're going to call a custom component using the C from our default namespace. Component is going to be called error panel. So using our error panel component, we're going to pass in context.error to some errors property, which probably has the @API annotation on it. All right, and then lower on in the UI, same sort of thing for opportunities. We have the word opportunities. We check, does opportunities.data have any value? And if it does, in line 20, we're going to display the opportunity.name followed by the opportunity.amount. All right, same sort of thing. And again, if there's any issue, we can send it to our custom error component. All right, so the HTML is a little complex here, but the controller side is actually pretty simple. This is the entire controller for this component. So once again, line 1, we're seeing we're importing Lightning element from LWC. We're used to that by now. Line 2 and line 3, though, we're going to be importing from some different Apex controllers. I'm going to start off by importing from my contact controller some method called getContactList. On the left side of line 2 there, I'm going to call it getContactList, but I can call it whatever I want. And then line 3, I see I'm using a different controller, an opportunity controller. and a method called getOpList. And again, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to store it as some value called getOpList when I reference it later on. So I'm importing two methods from two different Apex controllers. And then line 6 and 7, we see this third decorator at wire, right? So we talked about at track, we talked about at API, and now we have at wire. So at wire, again, is going to have some extra properties it can give variables. Number one, it's going to allow us to wire something to that variable. In our case, we're going to wire up an Apex method. We can wire different things as well. The other thing is going to give all of our variables two properties, a .data property and a .error property. And so data is going to be whatever is returned from that thing we wired to it. So in our case, the return value from our Apex method. And if anything goes wrong with our return value, it's going to be sent to the .error property. So when we're saying if true context.data, basically that's saying, did our Apex work? Did our Apex method return some value? And if not, then context.error is populated and we can use our error panel. So here we see we're wiring the getContactList method we imported to our contacts variable, and we see we're wiring getOpList to our opportunities variable. So that's why we were talking about context.data, context.error, and opportunities.data, opportunities.error, that comes by virtue of using the at wire decorator. So this is our JavaScript controller. Again, we are using Apex. The Apex, though, is pretty straightforward. Our getContactList, again, we have an annotation on our Apex method at Aura enabled, and we also have it set to cacheable for even better performance. And we're just returning a SOQL statement. Same thing with our opportunity controller. We have the annotations, and we're just returning a list of opportunities. All right, so knowing all that, if we take a look at the HTML for this component again, a SOQL runs, returns a list of contacts. That's great. Stores it in context.data. If context.data is true, perfect. Let's iterate over the contacts one by one and display all the names. And if not, we can send it to our error component. And the same thing we're going to do for opportunities. We're going to check for each opportunity and each op rather in opportunities.data. We're going to display op.name followed by op.amount. And if there's any issue there, we can also send it to our custom error component. All right, so what did we see in all of these demos, right? Once again, we saw component markup, right? We talked about that already. We saw variable and method bindings. Again, we've seen that before. We talked about our decorators at track, at API, and at wire. And we saw we can import from almost anywhere, right? We can import from LWC. We can import from Salesforce libraries. We can import custom components. We can import objects and fields. We can import from Apex controllers. Pretty much anything we want to import, we can bring in all sorts of different functionality into our Lightning Web Components, which I think is pretty cool. All right, so I'm building kind of all of this as step one for your kind of foray into Lightning Web Components and front-end development. Where do we go from here? So we've talked about how web development is already popular, right? JavaScript's been on top for 7 years now. And Salesforce has been constantly evolving to meet the demands of the users and of the web. We saw the front end has some similarities to the back end, but with all this embracing of industry standards, it's my true belief that Lightning Web Components are both the present and future, at least immediate future, of Salesforce development. And again, this is just step one. A ton of resources available as well. Just like with Visualforce components that you can look up, same thing with Lightning Web Components. You can find the Lightning Component library from the developer website. I generally just Google Web Component Library. Salesforce has some pre-built Lightning Web Components that you can kind of plug and play and beg, borrow, and steal the code from in their sample gallery on Trailhead. So already pre-built Lightning Web Components you can take code from and kind of reuse for your purposes. They have a whole website dedicated to web component development, lwc.dev. They have a great trail mix on learning web components, sfdc.co/lwc, and some resources from the Salesforce instructor, Joe Flowers, who teaches the course on making the move from Aura to LWC. If you're already familiar with Aura components, I recommend checking that out as well, bit.ly/Aura to LWC. If that's not enough and you want to take it even one step further, I highly recommend checking out the Salesforce Lightning Design System. You can find it at lightningdesignsystem.com. essentially it's a pre-built collection of CSS libraries. Salesforce is built for you, so you don't also have to learn CSS in addition to JavaScript. So these are things like adding styling, right? Adding borders and adding padding, some custom utilities, a bunch of different icons, things like accordions, progress bars, pinwheels, things like that. Ton of extra stuff that you don't have to build yourself and you can just kind of bring in. And again, that's lightningdesignsystem.com. All right, and with that, again, I'm Adam Olshansky. Feel free to connect with me afterward. All of the code I showed in this presentation is available from my GitHub repository, github.com, adam17amo/LWC101. And thank you so much, Chandigarh, for having me. Happy to take any questions.
Yeah, Adam, there are some of the questions in the chat window, so I can read them and I can.
Okay.
So we have one question from Vineet that do we have to import all the mandatory fields of any schema object to get it created one by one, or can we get through account_object?
My understanding is any fields you want to use, you should import separately, like we did with the name field. So I don't think, so technically you can utilize objects and fields without importing any of them. But again, if you do it that way, if the API name changes, then you're gonna have to update your code accordingly.
Okay. And next question is from Sumit. How can we insert the records using wired apex?
How can we insert records using wired apex without using lightning record edit form? So wiring is generally going to be more tying the methods to generally, I've mostly used it for tying apex methods to variables. If we want to create records without apex, generally they do, I think you need to use the lightning design system. I don't know, I don't think we use lightning record form in this component here. I don't think so. I mean, we used the lightning data service. I don't think we used a lightning record edit form, but even that component recommends using the lightning record form or lightning record edit form. Let's see. Yeah, I didn't have to specifically express it here, but we did use create record, which comes from the lightning data service. Yeah, create record, which we imported from the record API. So yeah, I'd probably check out this UI record API to see what other methods are available there. I haven't played with all of them. I'm most familiar with create record. There are probably some other methods in there that I'd recommend looking into.
Okay, and the next question is from Asmit. That the field name dot API name in the code, so we can't just use API name to get the field, or is it required to use both label name and the API name to get the value of the field?
Yeah, so again, it's not required to do it this way. You can reference the API name directly without importing it. But again, the reason we imported it was so that we don't have to worry about it changing. So if we change it, then we're gonna get a bunch of reference errors. Hey, you're referencing this field in this component, now you have to go change it. So you can do it that way. The recommended approach is to import it so we don't have to worry about if we want to change it later. But it's not required.
And next question is from Kishore, that when we import custom field email__c, and he wants to know that if we change the API name or delete the metadata from the system, will the metadata where do the magic, like the import functionality also again do the magic?
Yeah, we import a custom field. What happens when we change the API name? So I will admit I have not tested this. My understanding, when we changed the API name, my understanding is that it's supposed to update itself. That's a good question if you delete it though, because at that point it doesn't exist and there's nothing to retrieve. So I'm not sure what would happen in that case though. That's a very, I'm gonna make a note to follow up on that. That's a very good question. Unless there's a different Kishore B, I'm wearing the shirt I got from you at Dreamforce last year, actually.
Cool.
Thank you for the question. Let me follow up on that.
Yeah. If anyone has any more questions, please feel to unmute yourself. You can ask anything, Adam, about his journey, about the session, anything.
If anyone feels to ask anything from Adam, can unmute themselves and ask the questions.
So yeah, hi Adam and hi people. Just wanted to ask a general question to Adam that what is the job role that you do in your daily life at Google with respect to Salesforce? Could you just enlighten us?
Sure. The question was like, what do I do at Google on a daily basis?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I think probably is similar to a lot of you, combination of bugs and projects. So generally, I come in and kind of I tend to like staying up late and sleeping in late. So I tend to start my day after a lot of other people, and something's generally broken or there's something to take a look at for the day. So I kind of usually take a look at the bugs, or if there's some project I'm working on, I'll do some project work. Sometimes I'll be doing some code reviews. I probably don't write as much code on a day-to-day basis as I would like. So I try to, and more now, I've been trying to find more projects to do more front-end code. We, as you can imagine, are operating at a pretty big scale. And so not everything always fits in Salesforce. We have a lot of other systems we're working with. So a lot of integration work, updating Salesforce code to accommodate everybody else's changing APIs. So there's some of that. Way more writing documentation than I would like also, but you know, it's comes in handy later when something breaks and nobody knows how it works. So yeah, a combination of project work, bug fixes, meetings here and there. One of the nice things about Google is that there's tremendous opportunity for growth. If you want to learn things in Salesforce, out of Salesforce, there's opportunity for that. And Google being at the scale that it's at, there's also opportunity to kind of change teams to get kind of a new job without having to leave the company. So I was at YouTube for a couple of years, and now I switched over to the devices team. It kind of felt like, you know, you're getting a new team and new manager, and so you kind of get a new start, keep things fresh, and you know, different org, different things they're working on. But also being able to stay at the same company and keep the seniority and stuff like that is nice. So overall, highly recommend it. If there are any jobs out there right now, I think they're slowing down hiring for the year, but they are still hiring. So I highly recommend applying to them, and happy to provide any guidance about any interviews anyone may have.
Adam, a fun question, like I'm not sure, but how many users are there in this Google org? Like, is it large enterprise, so there must be many user and licenses for the org?
So it depends on the org. So every team at Google pretty much has a different org. So the YouTube org is different from the devices org, different from the cloud org, different from, you know, all the other teams' orgs. YouTube was, I think, one of the bigger orgs. I think they had a couple thousand. My current team, I think, is under 1,000 now. I know the cloud org is pretty big, probably 5,000 to 10,000 plus. A lot of the orgs across the company are relatively small. A lot of them are 10 to 20 users. So it kind of depends on the team. Both my team and YouTube also had kind of communities where we're dealing with anywhere from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of external community users as well there.
Cool. It's very cool, I think, working in
So
that.
it's a big giant actually.
Yeah.
And I think there must be a lot of pressure when Lightning came in and you actually needed to migrate everything to it. And by having so many orgs, it would be a task for everyone to.
Mm. Yeah, but
Yeah.
I think so. Like Adam has an expertise in Lightning migration. I think.
Yeah, and again, it kind of was team by team. So when I first joined, the team had kind of just finished their migration over to Lightning, and so we got kind of the last couple stragglers over, and then anything new we just started developing in Lightning. And then with the new team I just joined, they were already on Lightning. So again, everything new is for the most part is going into Lightning. We run into things here and there. Like right now, we're dealing with knowledge, and there's some weird things that can only be done in Classic. You run into that from time to time, but for the most part, I think most of the orgs at Google are on Lightning now.
Yeah, that's awesome. So if anyone has any more question, please feel to ask. Else, I think we'll end up the session. We'll have a code shared by Adam, and we'll also try to get the video on YouTube. So if anyone has missed it, they can.
So, Adam,
Parth, one quick question.
thanks for the overview.
Yeah.
Yeah, Smith, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, man. So, Adam, just wanted to ask, like, how does Google deal with large data volumes in Salesforce org? Do you have any idea about it?
Larger data volumes, yeah. So with YouTube, we were dealing with millions of records, and so one of the cool things that I had a lot of fun implementing was platform cache, where for some queries that have tables that are millions of records large, we could cache some of the data, and so we got our response time for some queries down from like 5 to 10 seconds down to 0.3 of a second, which is pretty cool. So we were doing some stuff with caching. We're trying to limit how many records we're updating from any kind of external batch jobs, so constantly tweaking our filters. For a lot of our external integrations, Google also has a couple of different data repositories. So data gets updated in Salesforce, the UI is in Salesforce, the validations are in Salesforce, and then Salesforce sends the data to some data warehouse somewhere that other teams can query it at scale without having to keep pinging Salesforce constantly. So we have a lot of kind of data backups we have running. And so I remember with YouTube, I was working to kind of get the timing right to not overload Salesforce and also get the freshest data. So constantly kind of tweaking things and trying to limit how many, what needs to be real time and what can be, within an hour, within a day. So constantly kind of working with the business to figure out where can we kind of optimize Salesforce's use cases and get people the freshest data possible while not completely overwhelming the platform.
Thanks, Adam. That's great.
Sure.
Yeah, hey Adam. Thanks for this session, Dixit this side. And one big question, Adam. So I want to know, like one area you mentioned that the way Google is using Salesforce. So I want to know what other areas the way Google is using Salesforce or see the potentials where Google can use it, like maybe for other internal purpose or any client base for which they are maintaining some support and all. So what exactly we can see how Google is using exactly Salesforce. Adam?
Sure. So I don't know how many specific use cases I'm allowed to talk about, but I personally would love to have everything on Salesforce. So I know there are a lot of use cases where it kind of depends, again, team by team, because every org is a little bit different. So we have, we try to bring in a bunch of stuff to Salesforce, and then we have our, UIs that you don't have to build because a lot of them are just out of the box. And some of that data ends up going elsewhere. Some external systems call into Salesforce directly. Some of them call into other warehouses that we've exported the data to. And then we, of course, have integrations as well. So there's definitely always more room, I think, to bring things in. But yeah, as you can imagine, there's a lot of different technologies going on, and everybody thinks their technology is the best fit. So it's a constant
Yeah.
discussion amongst leadership of, kind of priorities of, all right, things that are related to this go in Salesforce, things that are related to that maybe go into this other system. And so there's kind of a balance there. But as priorities change and technologies change, things change there as well.